When I was diagnosed with advanced Hodgkin's lymphoma, the news was utterly shocking. I had always prided myself on living a healthy lifestyle, staying active, getting regular checkups, and eating well. The doctor couldn't offer a clear explanation for why I had developed cancer, but he made it clear that my chances of survival would be slim unless I underwent aggressive treatment. Despite the grim prognosis, I was determined to fight with everything I had. The hardest part of all of this was telling my wife, Daisy, and our daughter, Luna. After 15 years of marriage, I knew how much my illness would hurt them. Daisy, who had always been my rock, was devastated by the news, as was Luna. I did my best to reassure them that I wasn't giving up, that I would fight through it. But as much as I tried to stay strong, I couldn't shake the worry in the back of my mind. The oncologist had warned that cancer treatments put an enormous strain on families, especially marriages, and I feared that it might drive a wedge between us. That evening, after the doctor's visit, I sat down with Daisy. I shared my concerns about the toll cancer might take on our family and marriage. Daisy promised me that she would stand by me, that she would help me through this no matter what. At least, I tried to take some comfort in that promise. Financially, we were prepared. I had a good insurance policy, some savings, and a trust fund that my late grandfather had left me. Our house was paid off, and I had even set aside money for Luna's college fund. It was reassuring to know that if the worst happened, at least they would be taken care of. A week later, I started chemotherapy. The treatment was far worse than I could have ever imagined. Chemotherapy drained me, both physically and emotionally. Some days I couldn't eat, let alone move. On good days, I was barely able to muster enough energy to get out of bed. Daisy and Luna had to take over every aspect of our daily lives. They cooked, cleaned, drove me to the hospital for treatments, and took care of all the little things that I simply couldn't manage. I did my best to help when I could, but there were many days when I couldn't even get out of bed. As the weeks passed, I began to notice subtle changes in Daisy and Luna. They were growing more distant, less willing to help. At first, it was small things. A request for a glass of water or some assistance moving around the house would be met with reluctance. I tried to shrug it off at first, but then I realized something was wrong. The strain of my illness was starting to affect our family dynamic. I could feel the tension building between us, and it was worrying. The real turning point came one morning when I had an early chemo session. I was already running late, trying to get ready to leave for the hospital, and I couldn't find Daisy anywhere. I called her, and she told me that she was too tired to drive me, that I should take an Uber. I was shocked. I had always been there for her, and now, in my time of need, I felt abandoned. But I didn't argue. I simply called an Uber, and I informed the hospital that I would be attending the appointment alone. The driver who picked me up was kind, making sure I got to my treatment safely. He even offered to take me home after the session, something I appreciated more than I could express. When I got home, I was physically drained but also emotionally exhausted. I confronted Daisy and Luna about the way things had been going. I asked them point blank if they felt I was a burden. Daisy sighed heavily and admitted she was overwhelmed. Luna, in a quiet voice, told me she hadn't expected me to be so needy, as if she hadn't anticipated how hard it would be to watch me go through this. I suggested that we bring in a nurse a few days a week to help with my physical care. This would allow Daisy and Luna to focus on their own well-being without having to carry all the weight of caring for me on their shoulders. To my relief, they agreed. I immediately made arrangements for a nurse to come in, hoping it would ease the burden on them and improve the situation at home. The nurse who arrived was everything we needed, professional, caring, and efficient. She made sure I attended all my chemo appointments, ensured I took my medication, and took care of the physical side of things that I simply couldn't handle on my own. Slowly, my health began to improve, and my doctors were pleased with my progress. But despite the positive changes in my condition, I could still feel a shift in Daisy's behavior. It seemed like she was resenting the nurse's presence. To her, it felt as though the nurse was replacing her. taking over a role that she felt was hers to fulfill. I tried to talk to Daisy about it. I told her that if she was willing to take on the responsibilities the nurse was handling, driving me to appointments, making sure I took my medication, preparing my meals, then we could send the nurse away. The only reason we had a nurse was because Daisy couldn't provide that level of support. Reluctantly, Daisy agreed, but only under the condition that we find a male nurse. I explained to her that the hospital didn't have male nurses available who had experience with oncology, and that I had chosen the nurse we had because of her expertise and understanding of my needs. Daisy wasn't happy with this, but she reluctantly agreed to the arrangement. A few days later, Daisy's frustration boiled over. She snapped at me, accusing me of making my illness everyone else's problem. I tried to explain how difficult the chemotherapy had been on my body, but she seemed to grow more frustrated with me. It was clear that she didn't understand how exhausting the treatment was, and no matter what I said, it only seemed to push her further away. That night, she stormed off, slamming the doors behind her. I knew that her anger wasn't helping anything, so I let her go, hoping that time would help her calm down. Later that evening, my mother-in-law called. She was upset about the nurse I had hired, specifically that I had hired a woman to help me despite still being married to her daughter. I tried to explain to her that I needed help and that Daisy wasn't able to manage everything on her own. I assured her that it was a temporary arrangement, just until I was through with my treatments. My mother-in-law wasn't convinced, but eventually stopped pressing the issue. For about a week, things seemed to calm down. I was feeling better, and my treatments were progressing well. Then, after another chemo session, I came home to find a moving truck in front of the house. Daisy and Luna had packed their things and left. They were going to stay with her mother. The timing felt cruel. Right after a chemo session, when I was drained and had no energy to fight or even express how hurt I felt, I had to face the reality of them leaving. I turned to Luna, hoping for some explanation. She was old enough to make her own decisions, and when I asked her why they were leaving, she simply said, "I don't want to live with you anymore. It's too hard." Her words were a gut punch, and watching them walk out of the door broke my heart. I felt abandoned and unwanted, alone in the very house that once felt like home. In the midst of all this, my brother stepped in. He noticed the nurse spending extra time with me and asked if I had any family who could help. Though he lived 3 hours away, he offered to take time off from work to stay with me until I could find someone more permanent to help. When he arrived, he was furious at what had happened, and though I was glad for his support, I couldn't help but wonder what had gone wrong, and if I would ever get my family back. The narrator recounts a difficult chapter in his life, marked by both a physical and emotional struggle. His battle with cancer caused a deep strain on his relationship with his wife, Daisy, and their daughter, Luna. Daisy, who had never worked since their marriage, had always relied on the narrator to provide for her and their daughter. The narrator took pride in making sure they wanted for nothing, but despite his efforts, the relationship began to erode. Daisy, perhaps overwhelmed by his illness or the pressures of their life together, made the decision to leave. She took their daughter and left the house, without giving the narrator the courtesy of an explanation or even checking in on him as he fought his illness. In the midst of his deteriorating health, the narrator's brother stepped in with a suggestion to help his brother manage things in the absence of his wife. Since his brother could only stay for a short time, he came up with an alternative plan to have his wife's sister, Kara, stay with the narrator. Kara was going through a tough divorce and was in need of a stable place to stay. She was studying radiology on a scholarship at a nearby university, and the narrator's home, being closer to the campus, would offer her a more convenient location. The plan seemed mutually beneficial. Kara would have a safe and stable living situation, and the narrator would have some extra help around the house. The narrator agreed to this arrangement, reassuring his brother that Kara would not have to pay rent, as he had no issue providing for her in the same way he had done for his own family. Kara was kind and considerate, agreeing to help out with household tasks like shopping, cleaning, and even meal prep without complaint. Though the narrator missed his wife and daughter, it became increasingly clear that they had no interest in checking in on him. As time passed, Kara proved to be more than just a guest. She became an invaluable support system. Her presence in the house not only helped keep things running smoothly, but also played a role in the narrator's recovery. His health improved significantly, and a month and a half later, the best news came. He was cancer-free. The narrator was faced with a decision. Though he had always had a strong attachment to the house, the painful memories of his life with Daisy and Luna were too overwhelming. He realized that in order to truly heal, he needed to start fresh. The memories of his former life were holding him back from moving forward. He decided to leave the house behind and downsize to something smaller. Though his wife and daughter had left, the emotional weight of their departure lingered in every corner of the home. Rather than hold on to the house, he chose to give it to Kara as a gesture of gratitude for her kindness and support during his illness. He no longer had any use for the house, especially if it meant that Daisy or Luna might eventually claim it. His decision was not an easy one, but it felt right. He was ready for a new beginning and a fresh start. He found a quiet spot in the countryside, a peaceful neighborhood where he hoped to heal and rebuild his life. Over a year later, the narrator had settled into his new home and begun to make a life for himself again. The neighborhood was full of friendly people, and he had even formed a meaningful friendship with his neighbor, Sophia. Sophia was a widow, and the two of them would often meet for drinks and share stories. One evening, while sitting on her porch, Sophia shared her experience of losing her husband to lung cancer. She spoke about how life insurance had provided her family with the stability they needed after her husband's passing. This conversation opened the door for the narrator to talk about his own struggles. He shared the details of his divorce and the estrangement from his wife and daughter. He was surprised to realize that, despite the passing of a year, he had not heard from Daisy or Luna. Though he had hoped for some sort of closure, he had come to terms with their absence in his life. One day, Sophia informed the narrator that she had seen two people hanging around his old house. They hadn't caused any trouble, but had knocked on the door and lingered in the yard. Sophia hadn't been sure who they were, but their behavior was suspicious enough to make her consider calling the sheriff. When the narrator looked into it, he realized that the description Sophia gave matched his wife and daughter. He was stunned. How had they found his new address? Only his brother and his wife knew where he was living. He felt a mix of disbelief and anger, wondering why they would show up after all this time, especially considering the way they had left him when he was at his lowest. The situation worsened when the narrator's brother called to inform him that Daisy and Luna had been harassing Kara and her roommate at the house the narrator had once lived in. Thankfully, Kara had made it clear that the house was now hers, and she had the legal proof to back up her claim. The narrator felt terrible that Kara had to deal with the drama and intrusion from his ex-wife and daughter. He called Kara to apologize, hoping that the situation would be resolved soon. As the story unfolded, the narrator revealed that his divorce had been finalized months ago, and his lawyer had sent the paperwork to Daisy's mother's house. He assumed Daisy had either ignored the documents or mistook them for junk mail. Either way, the divorce was final, and he had moved on. The narrator no longer had any interest in engaging with Daisy or Luna. His decision to end things with them was final, and he was ready to close that chapter of his life once and for all. The situation took an even more dramatic turn when Daisy and Luna showed up at his new house again, this time in broad daylight. The narrator had been working when he heard a knock at the door. He checked the security cameras and saw that it was his ex-wife and daughter. When Sophia, his neighbor, answered the door, they asked if she knew a man named Charlie who used to live there. Sophia was confused by the wording and asked what they meant by used to live there. Daisy clarified that she was referring to her ex-husband, who she implied had passed away after an extended hospital stay. Sophia, taken aback, asked if Daisy had any legal documents, like a death certificate or will, to prove her claim. Daisy was flustered, and the situation quickly escalated. She began to scream at Sophia, demanding that she stay out of it. Sophia, though uncomfortable, stood her ground and calmly explained that Charlie, the narrator, had filed for a unilateral divorce and had planned to leave everything to charity. She also mentioned that as far as she knew, Charlie had no other family besides his brother. The conversation quickly came to an end when Daisy and Luna could not provide any legal proof of their claims, and Sophia gently ushered them off the property. But the trouble didn't stop there. Daisy and Luna returned once more, this time causing significant damage. They broke the front window of the narrator's home and destroyed several of his potted plants. The neighbors, already aware of the ongoing drama, intervened and tried to stop them from causing more damage. The narrator, furious and shocked by their audacity, grabbed Daisy and told both her and Luna to leave. He threatened to call the police, and by then, his neighbors had already done so. The police arrived and took Daisy and Luna away in handcuffs. The narrator felt no sympathy for them. He had the entire incident on camera, including the moment they smashed the window. The evidence was irrefutable. After the arrest, the narrator cleaned up the mess, rigging a tarp to cover the broken window until it could be repaired. Sophia, always thoughtful, gave him some buckets for his plants to use temporarily. The narrator began to investigate why Daisy and Luna had returned, and he discovered that after Daisy's mother passed away, she and Luna had been forced to sell most of their belongings and were now living in a motel. When they saw a car at the house, they assumed the narrator had passed away and decided to snoop around, hoping to claim his assets. Daisy and Luna were now facing serious legal consequences. Daisy was charged with vandalism, attempted break-in, and assault. Luna, being a minor, would likely face community service. The narrator, though shaken, was resolute. He was considering filing for a restraining order against Daisy, as he no longer wanted any further contact with her. The relief of knowing that he could now live in peace without the constant threat of her interference was a small comfort. The narrator had moved on with his life, found healing, and no longer had to worry about his past trying to creep back into his future.